Hey everyone, it's Ryan Lizza with TELUS News. Very excited about this conversation today. It's with someone that I've been reading and watching regularly over the last few months because she has been speaking out on a very important and, in my view, underreported issue. We have with us uh, FCC Commissioner Anna Gomez. Commissioner Gomez was appointed in 2023 by a Democratic administration, obviously. And she has, I'm going to, first of all, I just want to, I'll say a quick thank you, and then I want to read something you said recently. But thank you for doing this, Commissioner.
Thank you.
So you gave a speech last month that got a good deal of attention, and I'm going to read a few lines from it. Our current political moment poses challenges unlike anything I thought I would face as an FCC commissioner. This administration has been on a campaign to censor and control since well before day one. And since day one, the FCC has been implementing the will of this administration and undermining the First Amendment at every turn. The First Amendment has protected our fundamental right to speak freely and to hold power to account since 1791. It is foundational to our democracy. Today, the greatest threat to that freedom is coming from our own government. Silencing dissenting voices is not a show of strength. It's a sign of weakness. It comes from a place of fear that opposing views rather than presidential decrees will win out in the public debate of ideas. Commissioner, I can't say that I have read every speech from every FCC commissioner, but this just struck me as an extraordinary statement. And I'd like you to sort of take us through. Oh, we lost her. We'll try and get her back, everyone. Just hang with me there. I will spare everyone the obvious FCC communications jokes about. Oh, there she is. All right. Let's see. Get her back. Just give me a second, everyone. Sorry, guys. Let me just. I might have to start over if we don't see her coming back. So just bear with me. I did this to Paul Krugman recently, and he handled it like a pro. I was very impressed. So, let's see if she comes back with that invitation. All right, you're back.
I'm so sorry about that.
That's all right. Brendan Carr, I don't know, he disconnected the line. All right, inside FCC joke there. I think you heard me read from your speech, and just start with a broad question of taking us through what backs up that extraordinary statement that the greatest threat to that freedom right now, to the First Amendment, is coming from our own government.
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for reading from my remarks. I have been very alarmed about what I see as this administration's campaign of censorship and control. And we've seen this throughout the administration. It is not just at the FCC, although weaponizing the FCC's licensing authority is certainly an important part of that. It is using the FCC to go after broadcasters for its editorial decisions, for their editorial decisions. It is investigating public broadcasters also because of the content of their news coverage, although they say they're investigating them because of their sponsorship announcements. But it's a sham investigation. It is going after law firms. It is going after universities for their curricula. It is arresting protesters. It is retaliating against critics of the administration. It is going after content at the Smithsonian with which it disagrees. It is going after diversity, equity, and inclusion at private companies. So what we are seeing, I could even go on. It is attempting to shutter the Voice of America and Radio Marti. It is harassing tech companies into not moderating content or providing fact checking that consumers want. So we are seeing this campaign, which is, to me, a threat to our democracy. The First Amendment is a pillar of our democracy, and we must protect it because democracy is fragile and freedom isn't free. And we must speak up when we see our government violating such an important tenet of our freedom.
Commissioner, I just want to go through a couple of examples that you've raised in the past of previous presidents who tried to use the regulatory powers of the FCC to go after news organizations that they didn't like, and I think you have a couple examples from both two pillars of the Democratic history, FDR and JFK. Could you just quickly tell those stories and what happened and sort of what the lessons are from that?
Yes. So FDR asked the chairman of the FCC at the time, Chairman Fly, to take action against the interests of a radio broadcaster, because back then it was radio. And the reason he wanted that action was because he was unhappy with how he was being covered by the news. The chairman,
As every president is.
as no one likes being covered by the news. It's true, unless it's flattering. But that's a fact itself is not necessarily what we want when we want the news to hold power to account. That is what the press is so important about. Anyway, so the Chairman Fly, pushed back against the president and did what an independent chair of a federal communications commission should do, and acted in the public interest consistent with the Communications Act. Then we had President Kennedy, who was unhappy with how NBC was covering him. And he wanted the chairman also to take action against NBC for that reason. And the chairman was then Chair Newton Minow, who is very well known. And the chairman Minow refused to take action against NBC, and in fact went to the White House and said, "Aren't you glad that I did not do that?" Because what he did was respect the First Amendment and the Communications Act's prohibition on censorship.
And so, in the FDR example, the FCC wasn't even that old at that point, so that set a sort of precedent for its independence. It's in some ways it's remarkable, given the regulatory powers of the FCC, that it hasn't been politicized and abused. We sort of built up these norms and guardrails to protect against it, and then everything sort of changed in the last 4 months. And I'm just wondering if you can take us through some of the examples that you have referred to in the beginning here of the most important cases that you've seen so far. And maybe if you could just start by quickly explaining what are the main tools that the FCC has for people who don't know the basics. What are the main tools that the FCC has that can be, in a politicized environment, that can be leveraged?
Yeah, so what we've seen under this administration is the FCC has initiated investigations against the broadcasters, or reinitiated them, because we have 3 complaints that were filed against CBS, NBC, and NBC, which the expert staff of the FCC dismissed earlier this year because they failed to make a case that any of these broadcasters, in fact, engaged in violations of our rules in the Communications Act. The 3 cases are a complaint about CBS and 60 Minutes, in which there's an allegation of news distortion because CBS showed an edited clip of an interview with then presidential candidate Kamala Harris, that it had edited down for time, which is something that is done very often. Um, there was a complaint against NBC for what's called a violation of the equal time rule, which enables parties to ask candidates to ask for equal time if one candidate is shown in one forum, and also requires the broadcaster to actually file notices that it is giving time to a particular candidate. So say it's an interview on a broadcast station, because again, this involves licensees of the FCC, the broadcaster files a notice and the candidate can say, I want equal time. In that case, NBC gave then presidential candidate Trump time on the NFL and I believe a NASCAR, race. So they gave
So,
equal time, no
so they
violation
took the
there.
so they took the complaint seriously and actually offered the extra time to
This
the
wasn't
other
a
candidates.
complaint. The complaint was after all of this.
I
They
see.
simply when the way that it works is the broadcaster files a notice, the candidates can ask for the time, and then the broadcasters provide that time. And that is
Got it.
exactly it. Then there's a complaint against ABC because they felt it was also news distortion because the moderators of the presidential debate were fact checking the president more than they fact checked then presidential candidate Harris.
So, not to get too into the weeds, but I think it will surprise some people that there even is a thing called news distortion that is within the regulatory framework of the FCC. And in my, limited research on this matter, it's been used very, very sparingly for very, very serious cases. Can you just tell us a little bit about what news distortion is? And for people who uh, don't know the ins and outs of this, this is what's at the center of the fight between Trump and CBS over the famous 60 Minutes interview. It's what's caused all of this turmoil inside CBS, inside 60 Minutes, and it's what is being used to hold up and politicize the merger that CBS's parent company is trying to go through. So it all starts with this news distortion complaint last year from a right-wing media monitoring organization that was thrown out by the FCC. But then, and Commissioner, I want you to tell me how unusual this is. Was reinstated under the new head of the FCC. If I've got all that right, just help us understand what the hell news distortion is and why this was thrown out originally and how strange it is that it was reinstated.
Yes, you are correct. These complaints were reinstated after they were dismissed by the expert staff. News distortion is a very difficult standard to meet because what it requires is for a licensee, so it's not the network, it's not CBS, and it's certainly not Paramount. It's the licensee distorted facts deliberately in order to mislead. So you have to have that intentionality in order to show that there has been news distortion that violates the FCC's rules. And that's why it's so very rare that you see a claim of news distortion succeed. So it is very rare for an incoming administration to immediately reinstate complaints against broadcasters. And I see it as a deliberate attempt to harass and bully the broadcasters into altering their editorial decisions in order to cover this administration in a way that this administration wants it to be covered.
I Were there other complaints, news distortion complaints from politically the other direction that say a liberal or left wing group had that had been dismissed last year? And if they were dismissed, were those similarly reinstated, or was it only these three that directionally were coming from the right?
So there was a petition to deny a license renewal of a Fox broadcaster from Philadelphia. That's not the same as a complaint of news distortion. That was a petition to deny, and that was also dismissed at the same time as the other complaints were dismissed. But that petition was certainly not reinstated. And that's one of the big differences that I see here, is that the FCC has gone so far as to issue the complaint against CBS, put it on public notice, and seek public comment about whether CBS violated the FCC's rules. Now,
Explain to people why that's important in sort of in terms of the process.
the reason this is important is because complaints are usually adjudicated with some degree of discretion until you actually make a finding of law. A complaint or an enforcement proceeding, as we call it here, is essentially law enforcement. We are enforcing our rules. And in this country, we don't enforce by mob. And what they are doing here is instead just pressuring CBS through this public notice, which makes absolutely no sense. Now, what you'll hear from people who want to disagree is, well, the FCC put out the petition to deny against the Fox station for public notice. But that's why it's so important to note that was not a complaint. That was a petition to deny a broadcast license renewal. And those do tend to be put out on public notice. So this is unprecedented, what's been happening here.
What's the status of these three reinstituted complaints now?
As far as I know, they're just pending.
They're just pending. Okay.
And as I say, these type of actions, whether they're reinitiated complaints or letters accusing broadcasters of misdeeds or letters to companies about their diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, they are not appealable. There's no judicial redress at this point because it is the bullying that is the point. It is not the final outcome because there is no way that the FCC could take any action against any of these broadcasters and survive judicial scrutiny.
Got it. So, in other words, if this complaint was settled against CBS, let's just start with the news distortion complaint. What you're saying is that would not survive judicial review because CBS would sue or would appeal or whatever the process is, and you're saying there's no court would uphold it.
If the FCC were to take adverse action against CBS, no court would uphold it. But that's separate and apart from any settlement, because that is, presumably when you have a settlement, you are settling the matter.
Right. All right. In your view, how is this news distortion complaint interacting with the merger that Paramount, the owner of the parent company of CBS, is trying to go through? Just sort of break that down for people, because there's so much that is mentioned about this, and I think people don't sort of understand how all these pieces fit together.
Yeah, so there's a pending transaction right now with Paramount and Skydance, and that is pending before the commission. And I don't, as a matter of policy, talk about pending transactions. There is no tie between the complaint and that transaction. When the commission determines whether to approve a license transfer, which is what would happen here, it does so using its remit under the Communications Act and a finding that transaction is in the public interest. What is problematic for me in particular, and that should alarm everyone, is that Paramount is in fact capitulating to pressure from this administration via all of the FCC actions, the administration actions, by trying to assert control over its news organizations. So it has pushed out the executive producer of 60 Minutes. It has pushed out the president of CBS News because they refused to capitulate, and we're staying resolute against these baseless charges. And that is very worrisome because that is the chilling effect that the Supreme Court talks about when it talks about violations of the First Amendment.
So here you are, a regulator working for the government who is actually outraged that this corporation is capitulating to this government pressure and interference.
That is absolutely correct. You do not want regulators like me interfering in the editorial content of news organizations. That is what the freedom of the press is all about. That is what our guarantees in the First Amendment are all about. Because the press holds government officials like me, like the administration, to account. And we need that for our healthy democracy.
I mean, I think it's just extraordinary that there's not more support for this position across the party lines. It just seems like the obvious endpoint, if this is the new way things are going to be, is that you could just as easily have a Democratic president who's going to install commissioners that will politicize the agency. I'm not saying you would do that, but it seems very short-sighted to uh, for one party to accept this as the new normal.
Well, I would actually say, in fact, that I've gotten a lot of support across the ideological spectrum, whether it's behind the scenes where people thank me for what I'm doing, or from organizations that are more conservative, more free market. We are seeing pushback against these actions because it is alarming for our future.
I want to talk about a few more minutes left. You've also raised concerns about what this administration is doing with respect to Section 230.
Yeah.
This hasn't received as much attention, but just help us understand what's going on there.
Again, I'm seeing an administration wide effort to push content platforms into not fact checking the content on the platforms, into not moderating harmful content under the guise of using the FCC and the Federal Trade Commission um, to bully companies into submission. And we've seen that. We've seen major content platforms capitulate and eliminate their content moderation practices. Why is this?
Meta, what's the most prominent example of that? Is it
Meta? Um, I mean, X did so before the election, but why is this problematic? First of all, it's problematic because these are private companies. And the Supreme Court has found that content moderation is, in fact, a form of speech that is protected by the First Amendment. So you can't have the government interfering in private companies' decisions on the environment that they want to create for their particular users. And users want to be able to have a product that they want to use. And it is users that want content moderation of harmful content or or I should say, fact checking in whatever services they use, whether it's a giant tech company services or it's a small upstart that wants to have a chat function during its live broadcasts.
No, I
The
absolutely. I
all
delete. Yeah, I fully support my right to delete any kind of comment on in on my Substack. I mean, that's what you're saying here is that the government is telling private companies, and someone in the comments said Meta is not a private company; it's a public company, but it's a it's public in the sense that it's publicly traded, but it's still a private entity. Just
yes,
to
it's not a
for,
government.
not to fact check the comments here, right?
Yes.
But because I think because this is an interesting debate because I have some some friends there are some free speech warriors who are obviously very worked up about content moderation and the government pressuring content moderation. So I think it's important to understand the argument you're making here is that the government is pushing these companies into the position of not being able to control the content on their own private platforms under the guise of free speech. Because this argument is very twisted because you have free speech advocates, at least self-described, on both sides of this debate, Commissioner. And sort of what you're trying to say here is that this is a government coercion in a sense.
That is correct. When we talk about the First Amendment, what we are talking about is a protection from government interference in the freedom of speech. When other people talk about freedom of speech, they might be talking about their freedom to say whatever they want on a private platform. And I'm sorry to keep saying private because I realize they might be public, but non-governmental entity platform. And I also get a lot of whataboutism that is just a false equivalency, because what we are seeing here is the use of regulators to go after content moderation practices or fact-checking companies. What you saw under the last administration was the administration trying to get these companies to ensure that they were fact-checking in fact content in order to protect consumers from hoaxes or from false information about vaccines or about COVID. Very different. In the degree to which this administration is weaponizing the regulators in order to go after these companies is not something we've seen before.
I think it's terrifying. One other issue that you have talked about is using the regulatory power of the FCC to promote policy goals that the administration cares about. And one of the first things that they have raised is DEI initiatives. And there was a merger of Verizon purchasing a telecom carrier recently that happened in interesting proximity to an exchange that Verizon had with the Trump administration about DEI. Tell us about that case and whether it's related, and just in general, what's going on with the administration's efforts to crush DEI efforts at these private companies.
Yeah, again, I see this actions against diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of this campaign of censorship and control. Because remember, it's not just about controlling fair hiring practices. It's also about freedom of speech and freedom of association when you're attacking diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what we've seen is the FCC has announced that it will not approve a merger or any transaction between companies where one of the companies or any of the companies have diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. And it is under this argument.
And defined how, because I think where this gets complicated is the definition of DE. We're not talking about illegal discrimination as defined in the code. We're talking very generally about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which can be defined in all manner of ways depending on the company. How is it being defined by the FCC, and how are they in these cases?
Well, I mean, I think in the entire administration, we're not seeing any distinguishment at all about what diversity, equity, and inclusion is. The FCC says it objects to invidious discrimination practices, but it has never defined what that means. And it's important to note that the Communications Act does not enable the FCC to go after equal employment opportunity practices for issues that are not related, in fact, to its licensing authority. The Supreme Court has found that, in fact, it is inappropriate for the FCC to take action in this manner unless it is part of its remit. And just determining that something is against the public interest doesn't all of a sudden make it part of the FCC's authority. But yet, because these are transactions that large corporations and corporate parents want to go through, they are capitulating. And they are doing things like sending a letter to the FCC announcing the end of all of their diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. And less than a day later, the FCC approves the transaction. I expect to see that over and over and over again. We've seen that with T-Mobile did so with a recent transaction, and I expect it to continue because it's about using the leverage of a pending transaction to exact a culture change and further the culture wars against these diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, which to me is heartbreaking.
No, it's bad, and it's bad for any newsroom that is owned by a big corporation because these corporations previously, in a lot of cases, had a very good relationship with their news departments. But in a situation where the administration is willing to use the regulatory power against these big parent companies, it is pushing these companies to reach into the hand of the newsrooms and meddle in ways I've been in this business for 30 years that we haven't previously seen. I know you got to go. The last question, Commissioner. Thank you for doing this. Um, why do you still have a job? You have been very brave. You have been speaking out for the last 4 months. This administration has been firing people at independent agencies left and right. What keeps you in your job, and are you worried that that's going to change?
I'm not worried about myself. I considered doing this job an honor. And when I was sworn in, I swore to uphold the Constitution. And what I am doing is exactly my job. As I have said before, if I get fired, it's not because I didn't do my job, it's because I insisted on doing it.
And but nobody's come. No, you haven't received one of those, infamous Doge emails, or I mean, there's been no threats to your your job.
I am unaware of any threats to my job. Our Communications Act does require a quorum. It also requires a bare majority, which means they need one minority commissioner, meaning a minority from another party. That may
Yeah.
be why. I sincerely don't know why, but as long as I'm a commissioner, and even after, should I get fired, I will continue to speak up because this is too important.
I completely agree with you. I thank you for what you've been doing and for speaking out. It's to me one of the most important issues, and the it's terrifying to see our government in the United States of America using the power of regulatory agencies like the FCC to intimidate newsrooms. And I think what you've been saying needs to be shouted from the rooftop. So thanks for doing this, and welcome to Substack. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you do some more on here.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, take care, Commissioner.
Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.